Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong. As a child, he was subjected to strict discipline and abuse from his father. As a teenager, he was described as a troubled loner and introvert. After being arrested at the age of 15 for theft in a store, he was sent, at his father's insistence, to a prestigious private school in England. However, shortly after his arrival, Charles was expelled from the institution for stealing from his classmates and returned to Hong Kong. Ng moved to the United States in 1978 and studied biology in California. He dropped out of college after just one semester, and during this time, he first met Leonard Lake and befriended him. Shortly after, he got involved in a fight, and to avoid legal proceedings, he enlisted in the Marines. In 1979, Ng enlisted in the Marines, but after less than a year of active service, he was arrested by military police for stealing automatic weapons from the military base in Hawaii. He faced a court-martial, escaped from prison in 1980, and returned to California, where he reunited with Lake. In 1982, during a search of their shared residence in Ukiah, federal authorities found large quantities of illegal weapons and explosives. Lake was released on a $6,000 bail, but went on the run, traveling across the United States under various aliases. Ng was rearrested under military custody and pleaded guilty to desertion and theft of weapons. Thanks to his guilty plea, he was released on parole and dishonorably discharged from the military in 1984 after spending 18 months in a military prison. After his release, Charles Ng immediately contacted Lake, who had rented a shed and invited Ng to join him. Next to the hut, Lake had built a structure described in his diaries as the dungeon. Over the next year, Lake and Ng indulged in a wild orgy of rape, torture, and murder. Their victims included 2 families and 2 small children. According to statements made during the trial, their modus operandi was to immediately kill men and children, and then imprison and harass women by raping and torturing them to death. Often, the torture was filmed with a camera, and in some cases, even the relatives of the victims were forced to witness the violence before being killed. The Ng and Lake murders could have gone on for a long time if it wasn't for Ng's kleptomania. On June 2, 1985, some workers at a lumberyard called the police to report a theft. An Asian man had left the warehouse after stealing a $75 vise, placed it in the trunk of a nearby Honda, and then fled on foot before they could stop him. The car was still parked outside the warehouse, and Lake tried to resolve the matter by paying for the stolen item. But the police noticed that Lake didn't resemble the photo on his driver's license, which turned out to belong to Robin Stapley, a man from San Diego reported missing by his family several weeks earlier. When they found a silenced pistol in the car, Lake was arrested and later identified through fingerprints. While awaiting transfer to the central prison, Lake ingested cyanide pills hidden in his clothes and died 4 days later. The investigation into the vehicle led the police to Lake's residence, where they found the van and the car of 2 of the initial victims, and behind the shed, the dungeon. In an improvised burial site nearby, the police found approximately 18 kilos of burned and crushed human bone fragments, corresponding to a minimum of 11 bodies. They also found 2 gasoline cans, one containing documents and identification cards of several victims, and in the other, the officers found Lake's diary for the years 1983 and 1984, and 2 videotapes documenting the torture of 2 of the victims. In one of the tapes, Charles can be seen saying to the victim, Brenda O'Connor, Meanwhile, Ng had fled to Canada, where his sister lived. On July 6, 1985, he was arrested for shooting a security guard, injuring him in the hand while the guard attempted to arrest him for shoplifting from a supermarket. Charged with theft, resisting arrest, assault, and possession of a firearm without a license, he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. After serving his sentence, Ng remained in custody following an extradition request from the authorities of the state of California. After a lengthy legal battle, he was extradited to California in 1991, where Ng faced 12 counts of first-degree murder. This marked the beginning of a prolonged series of evasive tactics and delays. He filed a lawsuit against the state of California for his temporary detention at Folsom State Prison and appealed against 4 judges assigned to his case, seeking their replacement. Ng changed lawyers multiple times, even suing some for incompetence. Later, he decided to represent himself, further delaying the trial by another year. The trial began in October 1998, 6 years after his extradition to the United States. Ng has consistently portrayed himself as merely a witness to the crimes, placing full responsibility on Lake, who allegedly planned the kidnappings, rapes, and tortures without involving any accomplice. He claimed to have been psychologically manipulated by Lake to the extent of losing his own identity. citing childhood abuse as a mitigating factor. The absence of problematic behavior in prison was presented as evidence of his rehabilitation. Psychiatric experts testified on his behalf, although they hadn't viewed the crime footage. Consequently, Ung was found guilty of 11 out of 12 contested murders and sentenced to death in February 1999. The verdict was justified by the lack of evidence proving his brainwashing by Lake. The trial became the most expensive in California's history, costing approximately $20 million. However, Ung remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. His story, marred by violence and tragedy, thus concludes in darkness, leaving behind unanswered questions and a sense of eerie malevolence.